Welcome back to Pokemon episode summaries. Today, I'll be doing episode 223, A Parent Trapped. The episode begins with Butch and Cassidy having returned in their submarine with the child Lugia Silver to the Team Rocket underground base, and they immediately presented Silver to Dr. Namba. Butch and Cassidy then make their exit as Namba puts Silver into an even more secure cage and taunts it, making fun of it as it desperately cried out for its parent, obviously terrified of the whole situation. Butch and Cassidy then return to Namba's room as soon as they left and inform him that this Lugia was extremely young. Namba wondered why Butch and Cassidy were telling him this, as he obviously knew this, although he soon dropped his question before Butch and Cassidy could say anything else, as he had figured out what they meant by this all on his own. Since the Lugia was super young, it must have had a parent who wanted to come save it. Upon realizing this, Dr. Namba obviously wanted both, and Butch and Cassidy knew this, so they suggested that they use Silver as bait to lure out its parent so they could capture the parent as well, knowing that the parent would obviously come for its child. Dr. Namba laughed evilly at this idea, as he remarked that maybe Butch and Cassidy weren't so incompetent after all. He then orders Butch and Cassidy to go through with this plan and use the baby Lugia to capture its parent, telling himself that the plan was almost too easy as Butch and Cassidy walked out of the room. Meanwhile, Ash and the gang, along with Richie and Oliver, had managed to return to the little cave area that they were at before they had went after Butch and Cassidy at the end of last episode. They continued to wait for Luca to come back with her supplies, as they all sat depressed, especially Oliver, at the fact that the baby Lugia was gone. Lantern tried to comfort Oliver, but it wasn't working. Just then, Luca arrived, back in her boat, with a whole bunch of food and supplies, although it had become nighttime by this point. And she immediately sees everyone depressed and questioned what the fuck happened, leading Ash and the gang to explain the situation, making her sad as well. Along with shocked, of course. I mean, who wouldn't be, after hearing that, after only being gone for a few hours, more has happened than in the past fucking 10 episodes. Luca eventually got over her shock and sadness, though, and suggested that Ash and the gang and Richie and Oliver do the same, and they all try and come up with a plan to save the baby Lugia. However, before Ash and the gang could begin brainstorming, they were then interrupted by the parent Lugia, who appeared after noticing that its child wasn't with it anymore, and it was trying to search for it, and had eventually decided to go back to where Ash and the gang were, to see if they knew anything. Oliver tried to explain to the Lugia what had happened to its child, so that the Lugia could relax a little bit, at least knowing the situation, so that it could help them. However, Oliver was too sad about Lugia being gone that he couldn't get out his words properly, so he just started crying instead. This leads the Lugia to just get confused, and think that Ash and the gang and Oliver didn't know what had happened, so it decides to just go away and look for its child on its own. However, it finds nothing, so it returns to Ash and the gang and Oliver, hoping that they may have found something out this time. This leads Ash and the gang to talk to Lugia instead of Oliver, and they successfully manage to explain that its child had been captured. However, this makes the parent Lugia extremely angry. Even when Ash and the gang assured the Lugia that they would do everything in their power to get his child back, Lugia didn't calm down, and its anger only increased, causing Luca's silver feather to glow immensely since Lugia was extremely angry, and its anger also causes a gigantic storm that threatens not only Ogi Island, but the neighboring island as well. The storm eventually gets so bad that Ash and the gang and Oliver and Richie and Luca have to seek shelter inside the nearby cave, thankfully sheltering them for the most part. Meanwhile, Team Rocket was in their Magikarp sub, riding the immensely strong waves caused by the storm, as Jessie was ranting about the fact that Cassidy managed to get Lugia for herself. James reminded Jessie that it didn't really matter that Cassidy got the Lugia as opposed to them, because at the end of the day, they were all on Team Rocket, so they all benefited from Cassidy getting the Lugia. However, Jessie reminded James of her goal to outshine Cassidy and give her and James some credit, as opposed to letting Butch and Cassidy take all the credit. Jessie then continued to rant about her disdain for Cassidy, as she tried to think of a way to get the Lugia back for themselves, when suddenly they were interrupted by Wobbuffet popping out of his Pokeball, and he had done so because he was scared of how bad the waves were getting. And sure enough, the waves got so bad that Team Rocket's Magikarp sub crashed into a seawall, forcing them to abandon it and take the chance at swimming out in the open waters so that they didn't sink with the sub. However, as soon as they jumped out of their sub, the Lugia happened to fly over them, and it wanted to take out its anger on something, so it proceeded to use Aeroblast on Team Rocket, sending them blasting off, as Dr. Namba, Butch, and Cassidy were watching from the underwater base, as Butch and Cassidy had managed to go out in their sub and put a camera out in the water, which happened to notice the parent Lugia. Butch and Cassidy laughed at Team Rocket's failure, as Dr. Namba was very happy that he was actually able to see the parent Lugia. One of the random generic Team Rocket members, who was in the standard black suits, expected Dr. Namba to get even happier when he reported to him that it seemed as though using the Aeroblast had increased Lugia's overall power, since the energy from the Aeroblast was then distributed back into Lugia, but Dr. Namba didn't get any happier at this, as he already knew that Lugia's power was limitless, and more powerful than any other Pokemon he had tried to use before, such as Feraligatr or Charizard, so an increase in power didn't even matter that much, because it was already powerful anyways. Meanwhile, inside the cave, Ash and the gang, Luca, and Oliver, and Richie were still aware that Lugia was still causing some immense destruction using its moves while it caused the storm, since Luca's feather was still glowing an immensely strong red, indicating that Lugia was still angry as fuck. While Luca and Ash and the gang were primarily concerned with the parent Lugia potentially killing some people with its destruction, Oliver was still more concerned about Silver, understandably, as he cried, wishing that they could get Silver back. Upon seeing this, Ash, wanting to help both Oliver and the parent Lugia, decides that he was going to go out there and confront the parent Lugia himself and try and convince it to stop its storm by assuring it that he was here to help the Lugia find Silver, and therefore him and Lugia could team up and hopefully actually manage to find it. Misty and Brock were against this, as they reminded Ash that the weather was terrible and Ash could die as a result, telling him that it would be stupid and reckless to head out into the storm in its current conditions. But Ash just rebutted that he's done many stupid and reckless things throughout his journey, and most of the time they worked, and proudly stated that even if the weather was bad, it didn't matter to him, as helping the parent Lugia find its child mattered to him more. Richie was inspired by Ash's confidence, so he decided to join as well, with Luca deciding to join as the third member, since she was totally used to bad weather, and Ash and the gang needed someone to drive her boat anyways, so that they could get out to sea to find the parent Lugia in the first place, and Luca didn't want anyone else driving her boat. It doesn't take long for Ash, Richie, and Luca to locate Lugia, as it was pretty easy to follow the trail of the devastating storm, and of course when they find Lugia, it was still mad as fuck. Richie and Ash tried to explain that they were trying to save its child. However, Lugia didn't listen, being too angered, and instead just used Aeroblast on them, like it did on Team Rocket. Due to Luca being a great driver though, she was able to see the Aeroblast coming and successfully move the boat out of the way very easily. Ash and Richie then try to convince Lugia that they were trying to save Silver once again, but Lugia ignores them and fires Aeroblast yet again, and this process repeats several times, with Luca being able to dodge every time. However, Luca almost failed to dodge one of the incoming Aeroblasts, so she realized that the waves were getting too rough and she wouldn't be able to dodge another one, so she warned Ash and Richie to make this next explanation count, and thankfully, Ash and Richie were eventually able to convince Lugia. After Richie and Ash tell it that they would have given up by now in fear of Lugia's attacks if they didn't care about Silver. Since this convinced Lugia, it stopped being angry, and as a result, Luca's silver feather stopped glowing red. And the storm subsided as Lugia then flew away, not agreeing to help Ash and Richie, but permitting them to look as well, as it went off into another direction. Ash and the gang are glad to see that the storm was gone and that Lugia was back to normal, and Ash and Richie and Luca then return to Brock, Misty, and Oliver, and decide to try and find Team Rocket's base, where the young Lugia was likely captured. However, even when Ash and Brock send out their Noctowl and Golbat to do an aerial search, and Oliver sends out his Lantern to do an underwater search, they're unable to find any trace of Team Rocket's base. Richie obviously found this extremely weird, since Silver should have responded to any of Crobat, Noctowl, or Lantern's calls. Ash suggests that maybe it was because Team Rocket had since left the area, but Richie doubted this, as he reminded Ash and the gang that Team Rocket was likely aware of the fact that there was a parent Lugia, and they would want to stay behind to capture that parent Lugia as well. After learning from Lantern that it only checked above water, not below water, Richie just believed that this was more proof for his assumption, stating that if Lantern didn't check underwater, then Team Rocket could definitely have an underwater base that Ash and the gang didn't know about, stating that if the Lugia was underwater, then that could explain why it didn't hear any of Crobat or Noctowl's calls. Ash and the gang agree with what Richie said, so they decide to send out all of their water Pokemon to search underwater, with Ash sending out his Totodile and Misty sending out her Goldeen, Corsola, Poliwhirl, and Staryu, not Psyduck since it couldn't swim. Oliver's Lantern joins the search as well, feeling bad for not searching underwater previously when it should have, and it then redeems itself, as it eventually is the first one to return to Ash and the gang and Oliver, as it informs them that it had found something underwater. So Ash and the gang gather up all their other water Pokemon, and they put on scuba gear and head down, with the exception of Luca, where Lantern seemingly leads them to nothing, only for everyone to then spot Team Rocket, who had somehow fixed their Magikarp sub and recovered from the blast-off by Lugia, and were now back in the sub, with Jessie angrily taking charge as she pedaled the sub straight to Team Rocket's underwater base, wanting to get revenge on Cassidy. Upon Ash and the gang seeing the Magikarp sub, they decided to follow it, so they were led right to the base, obviously guessing that the Magikarp sub was Team Rocket's. Right as Team Rocket and Ash and the gang arrived at the base though, Butch and Cassidy were reporting to Dr. Namba, who informed them that he had come up with an idea to put Butch and Cassidy's plan of luring the parent Lugia with the baby Lugia into effect, and therefore rises the underwater base up onto the surface. Because of this, all the doors in the base close, meaning that even though Team Rocket had just arrived outside of the room where Dr. Namba and Butch and Cassidy were, and were about to go in, they were now locked out. To make matters worse, water still seeps in through the bottom of the door, meaning that even though the room was sealed off, water still managed to get into the base as it lifted up, meaning that Team Rocket almost drowned as their room filled with water. Being frightened by the base emerging to the surface, Ash and the gang, Richie and Oliver back up from it and return to the surface as well, so they're able to see when the base fully reaches the surface. Luca observes this as well from her boat, obviously becoming frightened, not knowing what the fuck this base was. With the base now close to the shore, Dr. Namba uses a contraption to grab the cage Silver was in and lift him out of the base and onto the shore. The contraption then transforms into a different contraption as it places itself below the cage, with Dr. Namba controlling it from inside the base, with Butch and Cassidy watching with him. Namba then sits back in his chair as he patiently waits for the parent Lugia to eventually take the bait and arrive. As for Ash and the gang, they had watched the cage be lifted from the base onto the shore, and Richie correctly guessed that Team Rocket was using Silver as bait. As soon as Luca noticed Silver in the boat, she immediately drove her boat over to where Ash and the gang were and told them to get the fuck in so that they could go and save the baby Lugia Silver. Ash and the gang oblige, and Luca drives them to the shore, where Silver was located. Ash and the gang and Richie quickly head off the dock boat, heading onto the shore, and Oliver of course wants to go as well, but Luca stops him, claiming that she was going to look after Oliver just as she was looking after Misty's Togepi right now, and warned him that if Oliver went, he could fucking die, because if Team Rocket showed up, he probably wouldn't be able to defend himself. Oliver reluctantly obliged as he stayed on the boat. Unfortunately, right as Ash and the gang arrive on shore, the parent Lugia arrives on shore as well, having heard the cries of its child, so it had fallen for the bait, just as Team Rocket had hoped. Ash and the gang tried to warn the Lugia not to approach, explaining that it was just Team Rocket's bait, but Lugia continues toward its child. Ash and the gang try and run to Lugia's cage in order to block Lugia from reaching its child to protect it, warning the Lugia not to get any closer. However, they are stopped in their tracks by Butch and Cassidy, with their Hitmontop and Houndour. Ash and the gang noticed that Hitmontop and Houndour looked a little different, as they had devices on their heads, which Butch and Cassidy then activated, as Dr. Namba, who was watching the scene from the base, laughed his ass off, because he had designed these devices and knew that when they were activated, it would enrage Hitmontop and Houndour, and therefore make them stronger. Knowing that Lugia was a legendary Pokemon, Ash and the gang knew that it could take some pretty hefty hits, and they decided that attacking the Lugia to prevent it from going up to the cage would be easier than trying to break through Butch and Cassidy and their new device-equipped Pokemon. So, Ash and Richie did just this, as they sent both of their Pikachu to use Thunderbolt on Lugia to try and deter it away from the cage. So really, their plan was to harm Lugia in order to protect it. Unfortunately, Lugia was able to fly out of the way of the Thunderbolt. Butch and Cassidy were pissed off by Ash and the gang not directing their attention on them, but instead the Lugia, so Butch got Ash and the gang's attention as he explained what the devices on Hitmontop and Houndour did, as Houndour and Hitmontop glow red, signifying their rage. Cassidy demonstrates her Houndour's more powerful abilities thanks to the machine, and it unleashes a more powerful flamethrower, hitting both Pikachus directly. Cassidy was confident that this empowered flamethrower would be enough to stop Ash and Richie, but it didn't, as they called their Pikachu back, but they instead sent out their own fire Pokemon, with Ash sending out his Cyndaquil, and Richie sending out his Charmander, Zippo, although his Charmander was now a Charmeleon, as Brock and Misty pointed out. As Luca and Oliver watched from the boat concerned, Cyndaquil and Charmeleon both used flamethrower on the Lugia, trying to warn it yet again, meaning that they ignored Butch and Cassidy yet again, which pissed them off even more, so Butch had Hitmontop use Rolling Kick on Cyndaquil. Cyndaquil tried to ignore this triple kick and continue focusing on Lugia, but it was unable to avoid it, and the triple kick knocked it out, forcing Ash to recall it. Not wanting to leave Richie by himself, Misty then took action and sent out her Poliwhirl and had it use Water Gun, which thankfully was unleashed right as Cassidy's Houndour used Flamethrower, extinguishing the flame. Meanwhile, Team Rocket had also washed up on shore, although they were hiding in a forest away from Ash and the gang and Butch and Cassidy. However, they were still close enough to see the battle going on, and Jesse had come up with a plan so that they could get the Lugia for themselves, which was using an inflatable balloon Lugia to lure the parent Lugia to them. Afraid that Butch and Cassidy would get the Lugia first, Jessie instantly ordered Meowth and James to inflate the Lugia, although she didn't explain the plan to them yet, as she was in such a rush, so they didn't understand why they had to inflate it, leading Jessie to explain her plan. However, James and Meowth retorted that Jessie's plan wouldn't work, since the real Lugia had already been spotted, so it would be impossible to trick Butch and Cassidy or Ash and the gang with a fake one. Jessie realized this, though retorted that she was trying to come up with a better idea, and assured them that she would, although she had no idea what to do at this point. James and Meowth point this out, leading Jessie to yell at them, demanding them to try and come up with a better plan, instead of being useless fucks. Butch and Cassidy, meanwhile, then used a remote control to increase the intensity of the devices on Hitmontop and Houndour to enrage them even more, therefore making them even more powerful. Meaning that Houndour's Flamethrower and Hitmontop's Triple Kick were now even more powerful, as Triple Kick took out Misty's Poliwhirl, and Houndour's Flamethrower took out Richie's Charmeleon, forcing Misty and Richie to recall their Pokemon. As both Pikachu and Sparky see Poliwhirl and Charmeleon down, they noticed that the parent Lugia was still heading towards the cage, so they both used Thunderbolt on Lugia once again to try and deter it away from the cage for the second time. However, Lugia didn't merely just dodge the attack this time, it got fed up and attacked the Pikachu back, using Aeroblast. The attack missed Pikachu and Sparky, thankfully, but it instead hit Ash and Richie, as well as Brock and Misty, knocking them both to the ground, with all four of them being now knocked out, unconscious. This meant that there was no one to stop Lugia from going to rescue its child, which also meant that it fell right into Dr. Namba's trap, which was the contraption transforming into a field of energy that surrounded the Lugia as soon as the Lugia made contact with the cage, trapping the Lugia inside the energy ball. Much to Dr. Namba's delight as he watched from the base. Meanwhile, back with Jesse, James, and Meowth, they had finished inflating the Lugia balloon. After many minutes of failed attempts, due to Meowth and James making it way too large at certain points. Once they got it to the perfect size, though, they began to move the balloon, only for Meowth to accidentally scratch it, causing a hole in the balloon that released so much air that it sent Team Rocket blasting off, and left the balloon that James and Meowth had worked so hard to inflate deflated. Anyways, Butch and Cassidy examined the now captured Lugia, as well as the knocked out Ash and the gang and Richie, and decided that they should do something to stop Ash and the gang from interfering if Ash and the gang woke up. So they proceeded to put Ash and the gang inside of a cage and move it and Lugia's cage back into the Team Rocket underwater base, and the base then goes back underwater as Luca and Oliver watch from the boat hopelessly, knowing that they had to do something to help, although they didn't know what to do. The episode then ends as Ash wakes up inside the cage, now in the underwater base, and notices that Richie, Brock, and Misty were still unconscious, and panics because he didn't know what the fuck to do.